Hello, Tony. Can you hear me?
Hey Steve, I can hear you fine.
Wonderful. How's it going?
I'm very good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good.
I've been doing quite a lot of reading about snakes, and they are so varied, aren't they? In terms
Yeah.
of their adaptations, it's like you try and bottom them out. I know that they obviously have the reptilian and they have scales and stuff, but in terms of their habitat, how they hunt, how they behave, there's so much diversity, isn't there?
It is, and I think that's one of the keys to their success is that despite they have been limited in some ways by the body plan, i.e., they don't have any limbs, they have, found ways to overcome the challenges that most limbed creatures have, and just gone far above and beyond that.
I was reading about the theories behind when they split from lizards and how quickly they've evolved. Do you have any ideas about what you think are the reasons why snakes have lost their limbs and developed these very fascinating adaptations?
So there are two schools of thoughts on this. The first is that they evolved from aquatic ancestors, and we still have sea snakes around today. So that seems to be partially likely. Although there are lots of gaps in the fossil record, which mean we can't piece the evidence together perfectly. But the more convincing argument in my mind is that of fossorial ancestors are living underground. And so we have a whole host of lineages within extant lizards, those that are still around today, that have lost their limbs, and they superficially look like snakes. Here in Great Britain, your listeners are probably familiar with slow worms that live in their garden, their compost heaps, eat slugs, known as one of the gardener's friends. But there are other lineages of lizards around the world that have also lost their legs or have very reduced limbs because they live in loose substrate. And of course, if you're trying to burrow in that substrate, having bulky legs are just going to, get in the way and reduce your ability to tunnel. So yeah, the jury is still out on how snakes diverge from lizards, but it's likely with that, seeing as this has happened multiple times within lizard lineages as it is, and then those that became snakes just took it that extra step further and did something weird and wacky by themselves.
I was reading about some things that I didn't know. For example, the toxicity of their venom can last decades.
So yeah, this is one of the things you have to be quite careful with. Is it depends on the venom itself because it's a complex cocktail of proteins, peptides, salts, and other bits and pieces. And so typically in venom research, you collect the venom from snakes. It's then freeze dried for later use. But as you've just said, yes, some of that can still be quite potent, years in the future, depending how it's been stored. And that's something to be cautious of when handling historical specimens of snakes, of their venom, and stuff like that, because there may still be residues on those products or the derivatives of the snakes that may cause envenomation later on. And yeah, of course, if that's a highly venomous snake and it's from the other side of the world and there's no local hospitals with any anti-venom, then unfortunately you're not going to have a very good time.
I also learnt of a thing called a dry bite. So when the snake doesn't release any venom.
Yes. So this is the thing as well that's quite interesting with venomous snakes, and most bites will tend to be dry, depending on the circumstances, of course. Snakes can decide when to deliver that venom in their bites, and so at this time of year, in the temperate regions, those venomous snakes that are around are less likely to use their venom and deliver dry bites rather than waste their venom. The reason being is it's quite metabolically costly to produce it, and at this time of year they are favouring reproduction over venom production, and so the males will be basking out and about trying to get their metabolism up high enough that they can then produce sperm to then go and mate with the females. Only after that period will they feed and then undergo venom production. And so that's one of the reasons why why some snakes may deliver dry bites. Another reason may be that they don't have those huge onboard reserves of venom, and so it's uh, it's a very precious resource to them, and they obviously perceive us as not being food, or a worthy foe in some cases, and just decide that it's not right for them.
So they can choose when they.
They can, yeah, and some species and some individuals may have more or less choice over that. Again, the research is a bit patchy. Some of it's a bit it conflicts previous information, but from the evidence that's available from the medical world, it does seem that yeah, some snakes or some species in particular are less likely to deliver. I guess if it's a wet bite, if a dry bite is the is
I know what you mean.
yeah,
The other,
yeah.
the other thing I found out, which is amazing, is that they can hold on to sperm for several years if they need to, or a
Oh yeah,
very long time.
this is another great thing that snakes are able to do, and some other reptiles as well, is that females can, uh, as you say, can hold on to sperm for quite a while. They have conditions within their reproductive tract which are basically like little creches for sperm. They ensure that they are able to then be used later on to fertilize eggs. And there have been instances where, this has been a decade or more in some species. And the other interesting thing that can conflate this is that females can also undergo parthenogenesis, where they
Mm.
reproduce offspring without needing to mate with a male. And so where there have been cases where people have suspected that the female may have, come into contact with a male in the past without their knowledge, particularly, if it's a snake that's gone through the hands of different collections through space and time, there's no way to guarantee that it didn't come into contact with a male. They then have to uh, check the genetics of the offspring, match them against the mother, and see whether or not they're identical or if there is that difference from the father, and then try to work backwards from there. And there's also been confusing cases. There was a case last summer where a animal collection at a college down in Dorset or Hampshire, one of the two, woke up one morning to find that one of their male snakes had given birth to a lot of young. And again, it was thought to be male. It's easy to mistake the sex of snakes when they're young. And then because it had been kept by itself, it'd been like 15 years by itself in captivity. Its reproductive biology just kicked in, and it, decided to produce some offspring. Obviously, the times were good; it had enough food, water, that sort of stuff. And the caretakers of the animals woke up with 14 extra snakes that morning. So, interesting stuff.
Talking about the snake that's parthogenic. So is that the Brahminy blind snake, the flower pot snake?
So there's a whole host of snakes that can
Yeah.
be parthenogenec, but yeah, the Brahminy blind snake is an exceptional one for that because they're all females, so that there are no males, and they only reproduce via parthenogenesis. There's a few other reptiles that do this, some geckos, some skinks, etc. And there's two reasons. One is that if one or just a couple of them manage to colonize a new area, they can reproduce quite rapidly and then start to exploit those resources and then multiply up from there. The second is that those species may have evolutionarily won the jackpot. They've been able to adapt to their environment perfectly, and because these are in typically quite stable conditions and environments, there's nothing more that can be done. They've perfected it. They've got the t-shirt, everything from evolution. All right, mate, job done. However, with climate change, with diseases, these sorts of things, because all of the animals themselves are genetically identical, they can't adapt to those conditions, and yet there's potential ramifications from a conservation standpoint. And so, trying to understand the mating systems of reptiles like the Brahminy blind snake and others that may be parthenogenetic or obligate parthenogens, like the blind snake, helps us to then try to work out how we can best approach their conservation rather than those species that undertake sexual reproduction, because essentially there are very few vertebrates that undergo obligate parthogeny, where they're only reproducing via parthenogenesis, but it does seem to be more frequent in reptiles, and this is likely due to their chromosome systems. And so many people will be aware of the XY in humans and mammals. Some reptiles have temperature-dependent sex determination. This is typically the turtles and the crocodilians, and so the sex of their offspring is determined by the temperature that the nests are incubated at. And so higher temperatures lead to more females, lower temperatures of males. This is, disaster at the minute because of climate change, with nests being warmer and warmer and essentially feminizing them, which is, a huge problem because there's no males coming through. So conservationists are taking eggs, incubating them artificially at a lower temperature in captivity, then releasing them back into the wild. With the squamates, which are the lizards and the snakes, they use the ZW system. So, like our XY, they have two chromosomes called Z and W, following the same naming convention. Obviously, they're the next characters along in the alphabet. And that, because of the way that their chromosome works, the females have the ZW, and it's males that are ZZ. And because of a quirk with their genetics, whenever most species undergo parthenogenesis and they're female, they only give birth to male offspring, which is it can be helpful in some cases. Some species will how do I put this? The females will colonize a new area, for example. Komodo dragons are perfect for this, but there are some snakes that do it as well. To colonize a new area, lay a batch of eggs. The offspring then hide from the female. So if they're the Komodo dragon, they'll hide in the treetops where she can't reach them. When they reach sexual maturity, they'll then come down from the treetops, mate with their own mother, who's a clone of them, and at that point, genetic recombination takes place through the process of sexual reproduction, and then you have some genetically diverse offspring from that union of those two individuals, which are technically clones, which is a bit of a weird thing to get your head around, particularly when we think of it from a very mammalian perspective. However, for species that are trying to colonize new islands, exploit new resources, etc., it makes perfect sense, and so you just need to shift your frame of thinking there. But again, another weird and wonderful way that reptiles are slightly different from ourselves.
Yeah, I suppose, like you say, from a mammalian perspective or from a human perspective, it seems so weird to be able to reproduce that, a male and a female. It just, I think for a lot of people, they still can't believe that can actually happen. But like you say, from a biological perspective, it does give you some very distinct advantages, especially if there aren't many males around or they're hard to find. You can grow your colony, your populate, and increase your chances of survival.
Exactly, and all of these mechanisms have evolved for for certain and particular ways, and yeah, that's definitely one of them. But as we know from Dr. Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park, life finds a way.
It does, it does. The other thing that's pretty cool, I think a lot of people know that snakes don't have eyelids, so apparently they have some sort of translucent scale that covers the eyeball to protect it. But also, do they close their retinas when they sleep? Is that part of their how they
So
operate?
yeah, the, the inventive name for the scale over the eyes of snakes is called the spectacle. Who could have seen that one coming? Uh, and yes, that they have it. Ingenious ways, we'll say, in order to for them to sleep. Because yeah, when you look at them, the same with fish as well. You don't know whether they're alive, they're dead, they're asleep, they're awake. Especially when they're motionless, and they're able to to shut off parts of their brain or close their retina in order to undergo that sleep, and that depends on the species, the group of snakes it belongs to, and those sorts of things as well. And so there is some varied strategies there within snakes as a whole. But again, they've rolled the dice in not having these eyelids, which again could be part of that fossorial nature, trying to ensure they have got as reduced drag as possible when underground. Because the last thing you want is to catch something on a rock or a stick or whatever it is underground, and then unfortunately being wounded because of that, becoming infected or worse, and so yeah, they've lost those eyelids altogether, and because of that, they found a new problem that they've then had to try to solve, and natural selection has then found the solution to that, and is the one that they obviously are coping with currently, which seems to be doing okay. So it clearly works.
Uh, Again, doing some reading about sea snakes. Apparently, they can hold their breath for up to 8 hours, and they can dive pretty deep. This seems incredible, really. I think a lot of people might think that the swimming in the sea is a kind of afterthought, but these species seem perfectly adapted for their environment, don't they? It's where
They
they
do, and with those sea snakes as well, they also have a like a fin on their tail, so it's dorsolaterally flattened towards the end, and it's like a paddle that helps them to swim through the water. Most snakes are pretty strong swimmers to begin with, but that obviously gives them the advantage there. And yeah, they're really good at holding their breaths. You know, they don't have the same level of metabolism as we do, so they don't demand as much oxygen. They're taking, their energy from the environment. If the environment is the temperature that their body needs to be, then great. If not, then they'll obviously go out and bask for a little while, get warm again, jump in the water, and when they start to get sluggish, then they'll come back out again and bask, and repeat that cycle. But it depends on where in the world those sea snakes are. But they're typically in the tropics, especially in the South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific. So yeah, if you're in that area, keep an eye out for them. And again, it's just one of those niches that snakes have been able to fill, because the last place you'd think you'd see snakes is in the middle of the ocean hunting fish at coral reefs, etc. But yeah, here they are thriving. And those sea snakes are quite stunning animals, and be it's on my bucket list to go and see them at some point in the future. But yeah, again, just somewhere you wouldn't expect to see a snake.
going back to their adaptations, they are just so diverse, aren't they? I mean, what do we know what's driving these changes? Is it prey? Is it their hunt for food? Because they do seem to be brilliant animals at hunting and finding food.
Sure. So there's a whole host of factors that are affecting the evolution of snakes, and has affected their diversification. The first of that is probably the evolution of venom, and so venom has evolved from salivary glands. It's basically a really specially adapted saliva, and there are a whole host of snakes out there that have different components within their venom that target different systems, whether that be the blood, the nerves, cells, etc. And different groups of snakes will have different effects on people and their prey. And of course, that venom can also be used as a defense mechanism, as well as an offense mechanism as well. So there are spitting cobras that will fire their venom as a projectile from their fangs, which is quite interesting to ponder how that evolved. And there's some evidence to suggest that spitting cobras may have evolved alongside our early hominid ancestors, as they were sharpening and lobbing rocks at these snakes. The snakes obviously had to retaliate. And yeah, if you want to go check that out, there's some beautiful research on that. However, I would take it with a pinch of salt, because we can't know for sure. There are probably other animals there that are affecting this as well, such as mongooses, that, as we know, are a cobra's kryptonite, and other species as well. The other thing to think about here too is that the environment has changed a lot over the past, 60 or so million years, since snakes, really started to get going, and lots of them would have preferred those quite lush tropical forests, some nice complex 3D environment. You've got animals and prey on the ground, in the canopy, within tree holes, all that sort of stuff. And so snakes would have been trying to find, via natural selection, evolution, new mechanisms to hunt these prey, to find these prey, and to exploit those resources. One of the adaptations there are heat sensing pits, which we see in pythons, but also in vipers as well. And they provide, another level of just detection for prey. We're all aware of a snake's tongue, the forked tongue that flicks out, and that then senses scent molecules in the air that then go up into the roof of their mouth and the Jacobson's organ, and then they use that as like a bidirectional homing beacon to try to figure out where prey is in terms of number, distance, that sort of stuff. But again, this can also be used to detect a threat, and then they can get out of dodge if they need to, if it turns out that that scent is, something that's going to come and eat them. The other thing to think about again with diversification is just the range of environments they found themselves in. It isn't just a tropical rainforest where they would have flourished, but they're way up into the Arctic Circle. They're all over the temperate zones. They're in deserts. We've already mentioned they're in the ocean. There's barely a habitat they haven't been able to survive in, and that goes to show just how adaptable these animals are, but also how resourceful they can be too, especially in those extreme environments where food, water, and those limiting resources may be, extremely few and far between.
I'd like to talk about I've seen videos of rattlesnakes that have been decapitated essentially, and they can still strike, they can still move their eyeballs. Is do we know what's going on there? I mean, how long would that be able to happen for? Is it minutes? Is it longer than that?
So with the rattlesnakes that have been decapitated, the snakes themselves are dead. Their heads are not conscious, but they've still got reflexes and stuff going on, etc. Which is why their eyes and stuff seem to move and that sort of stuff. However, as we mentioned earlier, the venom glands are still in the head, the fangs are still there, etc. So if you step on one of those heads that has its mouth agape, you're likely to get envenomated. However, it's not anything like the sort of stories you've heard in the past where someone decapitated a snake and then the head jumped at them and that sort of thing. There's none of that going on. Yeah, unfortunately, at the point of decapitation, the snake is dead, and you're just seeing those reflexes, which I guess it would much be like a human decapitation via a guillotine. There's similar stories there where people's expressions have changed and people have spoken after death, etc. But you're not entirely sure how truthful that is.
Talking about flying snakes, again, we talked about swimming snakes and how they survive in their habitats. It's amazing how they glide, isn't it? And the research is showing they actually move their bodies to stabilize themselves to
Yeah,
help them in flying.
there is. It's a special place where they're found. These are species yeah, as you said, gliding snakes, but they're called paradise flying snakes in Southeast Asia. And in that region of the world, you've got gliding frogs, you've got gliding lizards, and you've got gliding snakes. And so there's obviously something in that environment that is pushing these animals to move between the trees quite efficiently. One of the problems that lots of these animals have, of course, is that they live high up in the canopy. The trees are quite tall, 50 meters or so, and so climbing up and down them is going to be, quite energy expensive. And then you're vulnerable on the floor because you're more adapted to be living in the treetops. Sorry, and so if you can find a way to jump between them, then perfect. You've solved the problem. You can just fly between those trees, as it were. And so the frogs have done it, the lizards have done it, and then the snakes. And we don't know which order that was in, but it was probably it could have been all at the same time, or what we know. However, it is something that's quite spectacular because the snakes themselves are pretty colourful, they're pretty vibrant, and to see them flatten themselves out and almost become like a wing where they're undulating and trying to stay stable and trying to get some extra lift and forward momentum is quite something. And yeah, there's a few documentaries that have documented that well. However, again, I haven't seen it myself, but definitely on my bucket list.
Do we have any theories about how the snakes can perceive distance? So how they know that they're not jumping too far? Are they able to measure, what's in their range to get to? So if they're looking to jump to another tree, has there been any research to how they work out if it's feasible?
That is a very good question. So typically, depending on the snakes, their eyesight is either quite good or quite poor. It's nowhere near as bad as people think it is. These guys are quite honed predators, and so in order to be successful, you need to have pretty decent eyesight. With the gliding snakes, I'm not sure if any research has been conducted on on their site specifically, but they belong to a family of snakes that are renowned for their sharp eyesight. So they're likely able to judge distance and all of that sort of stuff. And make some basic calculations to make sure that they don't overshoot or undershoot their target, because again, that then leaves you vulnerable, particularly if you're not leaving, if you're falling, sorry, falling, multiple meters out of the canopy to the ground, you're going to result injury or death. And so, yeah, natural selection is likely sorted that problem out, as it were. Although the snakes themselves are quite elusive, so trying to study them does make it a little bit tricky. Uh, but yeah, if that hasn't been done, then listeners, there's a piece of research for you guys to go and do in your spare time.
Ireland is famously snake free. I think New Zealand is too. I know they have sea snakes maybe off their coast. Do we know why these countries have never had any snakes, or have they and they've just died off?
Sure. So Ireland probably had snakes historically, like pre the ice ages. But during the last glacial maximum, which was about 15,000 years ago, most of Ireland was still under, 2 kilometers of ice. Most of Great Britain was, and it was only the very southern tip of the country, typically about where the line between the Bristol and the Thames channels that wasn't full of ice. And so only those, and it would still have been tundra, still have been quite cold. Only those species that were cold tolerant could have then colonized that part of the country. And then, as the ice receded, we became more of an island. And then those species that we had then became stuck here. No more from the continent could colonize, and so that's one of the reasons why we have a very depauperate number of reptiles and amphibians compared to the continent. And typically, our assemblage is quite close to that of Sweden, which is interesting to note, but again, goes to demonstrate that those species that were cold tolerant were the ones that we ended up with.
Steve, thank you for talking to me. It's been fascinating. Like I mentioned, snakes are just so versatile. I think for a limbless creature, they've achieved so much.
That they have, and that they still surprise me every day. To think that these species don't have any arms or legs, yet they've overcome all the challenges that we would have to face as a limbed animal is just mind blowing.
Take care, Steve.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye bye.